I'm Sora Luxon, and this is Magic Lesson number 73, Symbols and Self-Care, by way of answering questions from Brooklyn and Portugal, I believe. And if you are the person who happened to be that Portuguese listener who sent in your questions, hola, legal, which I think means something closer to legit in Portuguese, whereas here it would mean cool, as in very nice. But você escreve bem inglês. Your very first question: can one view a symbol from the perspective of an egregore, in the sense that if a group of people see it as a representation of something, that energy will remain attached to that symbol and will be present even for the person who sees that symbol differently? The unified unconscious would say yes. To break the question down a bit for others who may wish to benefit from its insight, an egregore is like a pool of energy that, once established or found, can be drawn upon by others who gain access to it, or, say if you're part of a formalized tradition, are given access to it. And yes, symbols can carry their own confluence vectors as keys to egregore pools of energy, where the conflux of any minds perceiving a specific thing become jointly relatable data points. It creates a power lake of that generalized identity of that thing. Animated potential centered on a symbol is another way to think of it, be it a word, image, an amorphous entity, what have you. If many magicians pour energy into a specific sigil, for instance, it can then be drawn upon by any of them or by anyone who knows how to identify and unlock it. If you've been given a compass to do so, you could find it without ever being given the means via the specific tradition. If a specific image, like a logo, again, that's another symbol, is seen and energized by hundreds or hundreds of thousands of eyes who know what it represents, then to them, that logo becomes a very powerful thing with its own energetic inertia, which again can be used or manipulated by someone, as long as it's in keeping with the overriding energies identifying intentions. You could use an elite car brand logo, for instance, not to sell a car, but inside the subtext of, say, some other commercial, to manifest, again, not that car or that specific brand's potential itself, but the potential in the unconscious of the viewer of that symbol, of other interconnected egregores, such as wealth, power, material security, speed perhaps, or vitalic dominancies. And yes, if what you mean is, will the energies of a symbol relating to an egregore, which they do, or can, remain present even for someone who doesn't know what it refers to, maybe, who doesn't have that established reference point in place? Yes. Those energies can still be accessible and have an effect on that individual, irregardless of them perhaps being an outlier who doesn't comprehend a symbol the way a majority or the majority does. There still will be a latent effect depending on the power behind the actual symbol itself. The collective unconscious plays into this somewhat, where there really are structures of unconscious mind that are communally shared, albeit unknowingly, between seemingly disparate or separate beings, members of the same species or vibrational harmonies. In the Jung archetypes, for instance, Carl Jungian forms, you have the presentation there of the self as one archetype, which is seeking to represent the unified unconscious, that collective unconscious state that we all share. The non-conscious yet shared mindscape of the whole is also prevalent in aspects of lucid dreaming. That's an adept craft whereby the practitioner remains fully aware while asleep and can seek out very specific information that is present to them only because it's been presented to someone else's awareness or something else's awareness, and then can be accessed in a non-conscious state or a non-conscious realm. Although you have to be aware of things like psychopomps or any other guardians of the astral and akashic vistas. But again, yes, for many reasons, yes to your question in general. However, you may choose to approach and interpret it. It's not only possible, but highly probable that a symbol attached to an egregor's energies is going to, quote unquote, mean, as you put it, be perceived by, have the effect on someone who doesn't recognize it to some extent the same way it would as on anyone else who does recognize it. Again, bearing in mind that it depends on the purity of the symbol, the power and the experience of the Magi who established it, the relevant power established behind the symbol, if it's implementing itself as some sort of a gateway or threshold to a larger egregore, the implementation on the mind of the subject who's perceiving it, how well that's being done. I mean, there are sigils attached to light egregores that people without sight can and will see and feel the effects of. Just being in the presence of these things is going to have an effect if it's done well. I will make one small addendum here. I have known specific individuals who errantly have had unknown characteristics of self, usually in a physical sense, sometimes not, sometimes mental. But since things like sigils often require, say, physical sight for implementation on the perceiver, someone who's, say, colorblind in a very specific way, to where a colored intention sigil, where the color actually plays into the meaning of the design, that isn't going to unlock a specific door for that colorblind person who sees it in the way that it was perhaps intended by its creator, because they are, say, accidentally protected from the full confluence of information accessing their mental horizon, which then allows for spiritual access. So outliers do exist in some sense and in some ways, sometimes. But there still is going to be some transmutation of energetic potential. There's still going to be some access established, some effect, just not in the same way, or perhaps not as undiverted an energetic river as the establisher of, say, that sigil might have intended. Great words of power, for instance, are going to channel energies in the presence of any individual, whether or not they can even understand the language they're written in. Such as abracadabra, that great healing potential, done in that beautiful pyramid, algorithmic pictorial, but not in the same way as someone who does understand it, who can read and write in that language, who does see the deeper implications right on the forefront of that image. It's still going to have an effect. The effects are going to happen differently over different periods of time, and they're going to have different amounts of power attached to them. And then there's also ego reactionary states within our state as human beings that can subvert egregore energies in less than useful ways. I've seen that. Many of us have seen it. I'm trying to think of a way. In simplified terms, say for most Christians, and even people who aren't, the cross is going to be perceived in a very specific way, in a very established way, and it's going to have a very powerful effect because of the power that's behind it on most people. And that effect is generally a good thing or a great thing. It's going to, be attached maybe to belief, faith, healing, perceptions of religion, for better or worse. For those who ascribe to geometric perfection, that same cross is, the very stable cube, the three-dimensional square of truth. That's what it's the blueprint of. So it's this good symbol, one could say, in a very real way. The cross itself has powers behind it that are going to influence most minds on the subconscious level in a certain way, whether or not they want it to. And to the person whose best friend, maybe, in some weird horror movie, was tragically hung on a cross and then tortured, it still is those other things to some greater or lesser degree. It's still the perfection cube of three-dimensional space, in the non-conscious mind, outlaid on a one-dimensional plane. It still is the cross of the Christians that's going to stand for peace or love or unity or perhaps, great wars. But because of the way they know it fundamentally as a mammal in an ego state, the powers behind those other meanings are going to have less direct access to that person whose friend was murdered on a cross, whose ego will jump to the foreground to protect them very viscerally against what it perceives to be a threat to its own manifested definitions of reality. For them, a cross is a torture device first. And so some of the energies are dissipated or moved in other directions. A symbol of math or love is going to come far second or third to interpreting that image as something painful. And so accessing the powers behind the symbol is made somewhat more difficult while within the trapped schism of mammalian vessels subject to physical and psychological traumas. That doesn't mean the egregore isn't a truth or a reality and that it isn't latently being perceived or accessed in some way, just not possibly within this lifetime, within this mortal coil, whatever path they're on within the spiral at this moment. Doesn't mean the egregore's not there. Doesn't mean that they can't get to it or that it isn't actually accessing them. It does mean that while here in certain ways, it might not work as well as it will on other people who haven't had that experience of it being a torture device. And the same can be said of any symbol. An axe to a woodcutter is useful. Warmth, necessity, income. To Snow White, it's death. To the child whose parents were axe murdered, it stands first for temporal pain, atrocity, loss, hopelessness. Until those identifiers are chosen to be rerouted by their holder willfully, which, by the way, you can do in either direction, or until the locked gates of perception placed on a specific physical identity by current existent forms cease to bar them from accessing the greater power and intention, the truth behind the original symbol. So that egregore pool behind those lead gates of locked perception, it doesn't mean it's not there. It doesn't mean it can't be accessed or isn't being accessed. It does mean sometimes you're not going to be swimming in it. So yes, generally energy remains attached to its symbol, but there are, as with everything in magic, specificities and exceptions tied to that more generalized affirmation of the rule. You have to be very careful when you talk about symbols. You have to be very non-direct. With the honing of sigils, for instance, you have to be very detailed, very careful. It's an art, and it requires attention to detail. And even when you think you've gotten it all, there's probably things about it you don't even know yet. Next question. Even though I imagine that the rituals taught by the different existing magical systems are, as a result of experience, the best known ways to attain specific results, Can someone do one's own magic without learning any specific magic system and create one's own spells/rituals? Excuse me, I'm getting a sip of tea here. And is it less effective? Yes, you can do your own magic without using a specific system. And yes, it will be less effective. Not because it's right or wrong, not because you're implementing it well or poorly, not because you may or may not stumble across highly functioning energetic properties that can be attuned to different purposes, but mostly because using a magical system that's already established, along with being more powerful because of all the others who walked the path before you, learning what does and doesn't work, experience, as you yourself noted. Anyway, using a pre-existing magical system, it gives you the structure. It gives you the blueprint. I don't know why you turn your back on the pyramids in order to try to rebuild them. You're being handed the stratum to then actually learn how to do what you wish to do. And that is a far more powerful thing than reinventing the wheel. It's like if you wanted to erect the Sistine Chapel, can you start by finding a blunt tool on the ground and some hardish material and then working out maybe how to raggedly cut an angle in wood or chip away at a stone? I mean, yeah, you could. You absolutely could. Invention is necessity and all that, but it's going to take a really long time to build even a hut or shack, which is probably the most you could ever hope for in a lifetime, let alone any, sort of more advanced structure, like a full house or a cathedral. But yeah, eventually, if you're diligent and you pound two rocks together, you're going to work out some sort of element evading shape / structure. But it's going to be drafty in there. You likely won't have plumbing. You'd be living back in the dark ages. It'll sort of function if you're really diligent about recreating what's already known. But if you use systems that are already established and learn the structures from them so that you then can do whatever you want. If someone it's trying to hand you a laser circular saw and a PVC pipe cutting drill bit, and then quickly is able to outline for you how, geometry, engineering, architecture works, then you're going to be able to use that underpinning of learning to apply your creativity and actually build something you want to build. You're going to be able to apply your skill set, your influences, in actually making something magnificent. If you have to reinvent the screwdriver, you're just not going to get the same results, and you're not going to get there very quickly. You probably won't even manage to figure out for yourself, that Phillips heads exist, because you'll be using a flathead with, non-lag sunk screws from beginning to end, because that's the most you're able to invent in a lifetime. So kind of consider it from that perspective. Why refuse the common sense of what's available to apply to serve yourself in the best ways possible? So this next question came from Instagram, I believe from Brooklyn. How do I stop people from hearing my mind, the things I think about? You can make people try to do what you want them to do. I'm tired of people wanting to do what I want them to do. Unintentional, emotional confluence going on there, maybe. You can implement magical practices, both to be less unintentionally charismatic, if that's what's going on, or to clear your mind so that others can't overhear it, if that's what's going on. There are many wonderful Eastern practices that are very useful for these things. honestly, they tend to require a lot of time, sometimes years of training and meditation to implement them well. You know, undoing a glamour at will that you're projecting unintentionally can be a bit of an art form to learn in and of itself, how to become less attractive to others, or how to keep others from, say, eavesdropping on what you are maybe projecting very loudly on a mental plane without meaning to do so. And I advocate that everyone look into Eastern practices and begin learning those things that take all that time and experience to be able to call up in the moment when you need them. I really do believe in carrying that forward until some form of, hopefully, mastery is established in all of us. But in the meantime, for short-term purposes, one of the simplest and quickest solutions to what you're describing here that's safe as a magical practice for even the freshest neo is to do a lesser banishing ritual. Banishing rituals, you find these in the Golden Dawn, sometimes in Rosicrucian and Freemasonry. A lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram, also well established in Wicca at this point, I believe. Doing that daily, along with beginning the process of keeping elemental forces at arm's length, which allows for enough space to begin the great work of balancing oneself, both internally and externally. It also has this very helpful side effect, if you would call it that, of cultivating focus in the practitioner's mind. That's what ritual does for us when we do it every day. It's one of those symptoms. It's not perhaps the main intention of our ritual, but it is this wonderful, a massive beneficial service we give into ourselves side effect that's established by using a formalized ritual structure, is to allow it to create focus in the practitioner's mind, which is then there to be drawn on in other ways during your regular day. That focused perception, that it's something that the newest to the most experienced practitioner is constantly building in him or herself at any level. And it starts, once you start to establish it, to cultivate it, it starts to present itself in wonderful ways without even being called up or called upon once a formalized ritual is established in the individual. And that focus, it is weapon numero uno in clearing one's own mind of distraction, so that mental strength and possibly even barriers can be erected if needed, if that's what you're asking. Thinking loudly isn't the problem. Thinking loudly when we do not wish or are not intending others to have easy access to our mental states, that is the issue. So it isn't that you're thinking too loud. There's plenty of times when you wish people could read your mind, right? It's that you're doing so unintentionally and being overheard. And that problem, it is solved or made better. It's not really a problem. It's an obstacle to be made better. And it's made better by honing intention, which begins with focus. It's that age-old trick, right, of you don't clear your mind when you're trying not to think about things. You choose where to direct it. Let's say someone's trying to psychically break into your mind. You don't try to not think about anything, because things are going to pop into your mind, especially those things you want least for someone to find, perhaps. Instead, you might erect the image of a brick wall in your head. That's actually how you clear your mental space, that horizon, from someone else's perception. So in the same way, you don't begin the practice of meditation, for instance, by saying, I have to sit here and think of nothing. That's very stressful and very impossible, especially when you're starting out. Instead, what you do is focus intentionally. You focus on something specific. You think on purpose about something. You're learning how, by will, by purpose, on purpose, to choose what to think. It might be your guide's voice, perhaps, that's leading you through a meditation. It might be your own breathing that you're focusing on. It could be a vowel sound, such as Om. But you do focus, you do think about something, just something very specific, very particular, and on purpose. And that then trains intention focus, which will keep others, along with a lot of other things, from overhearing you when you may not want them to. If you don't unintentionally project thoughts, no one's going to pick up on them. Also, if you happen to be a practitioner of, any of those sects or the original Golden Dawn, middle pillar rituals, if you're not, white light meditation exercises, you'll find a lot of that in Crowley and in different more neo, Thelamite and neo-pagan practices, but middle pillar rituals, white light meditation exercises, whatever the situation, if you take a few moments to perform either of those mental cleansings and reinforcements, then you're going to energize, balance, protect, and guard yourself immediately. Not because you need to be guarded, but because it's invigorating. And you will be wholly and well, protected from all manner of interference, including psychic interferences, if that's becoming a problem. Next question here. Let's see. How do I know things and feel the truth but can't remember where from? That's, basically that question says, I'm beginning to feel Magick's influence on my life. What magic is has to do with rediscovering that part of ourselves that always was and is in contact with Source, with the All, with what some call the divine or divinity, perhaps the great architect, God consciousness, the higher self in communion with the All. However you're defining this, what you're feeling is very common. It's a result of the shatter, of the origin fracture, of your being one facet of the All, manifested into temporality to experience itself. That's what you're actually doing. You're not a soul trapped in a body, is one way of putting it. You are a body trapped in a soul. So that's why you can feel the truth, but you can't remember where from. The form that reality takes for you, for each of us individually, is in direct correspondence to the light, to our mental manifestation of the light's forms. You can maybe think of it this way. If our layer of multi-universality exists in part as a quantum field as a result of the divine energy pushing what it is up against what is not, some of what is not perceives itself to be broken and separate from that whole, but very really is experiencing itself as separate. Whether or not that is a fundamental truth, that's how it knows itself to be, and then is able to generate itself as an identity into a quantum field of, it's basically like a piece of energetic flotsam. It's sort of like debris in a great black ocean that then absorbs and interacts with the potentials around it until, say, algae and a reef grows on its underside, and those rays of life-giving energy that are being perceived to be far away, but that are still touching it and basking its crown, are allowing for growth in greenery and palm trees to spring up on the top side of it, until eventually that piece of flotsam, that debris, now only knows itself as an island. and thinks itself to be its own entity, its own mass, as it is. Because in one sense it is, and it can't recall in this current, brilliant, vivacious material form of being island that it was once and still is a chunk, a rock, a pebble of origin solid materia that's now scattered against a backdrop of blackness with all the other little pieces that also think themselves to be islands. And then we perceive ourselves as our own worlds because we are, in one sense, our own worlds, even though in another sense we really aren't. Material substance arises out of a specific energetic field. Right? Science would admit to that. And that field is light litter from source. Some people call it angels. That we are existing inside of a quantum field as part of a quantum space that is made up of radiant offshoots, the divine energy sparks in the dark. So it's not that you can't remember why you know things and feel truth. It's that you are knowing and truth, but forgetful of it. You're already back there. You think you're trying to get back to somewhere. That's not what's actually going on. You're already back there and don't know it. That you're part of this bigger story, if you will, automatically. But in this form, as you're interpreting yourself to be, you can't realize yourself in that way at all times. If you're busy thinking of yourself as part of, energetic flotsam inside of a quantum field and trying to cross a road while not paying attention to the bus that's going to hit you because you don't see yourself as an individuated entity, you're going to get killed by a bus. That's not very useful, right? So in this form, you can't always be realizing yourself in that greater way, inside the restrictions of physical manifestation, inside of temporality, for instance, or inside of your interactions with others, perceiving them to be other entities, which they aren't. But that's the whole point. That's what we're here to experience, the experience of living in the material plane. So to try to get away from it or to ignore it or to dismiss it or to think that it's wrong or not the greater truth, it is the greater truth. It is part of that greater truth of growing and then evolving and consequentially dying. That's part of experiencing this existence. That's why we're here. And then transmuting and transforming. All those things are what we're living life, partially convinced that we're somewhat separate from the whole for, so that we can perceive ourselves to be personality and specific identity. So how do you know things and feel truth? Because everyone does. It's just how much of it do we forget and then convince ourselves that we don't know. I'll try to get to some more of these questions next time because there are more questions. Until next time.